Hello, everyone, and welcome. Yes, my name is Arafire. Welcome to another episode of All Talk No Shock, where I am joined by the one and the only Chris McFeely. Chris, thank you very much for coming along. Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on.
Chris and I are going to go through today the law of Transformers because there's enough to get our teeth into. And with some of the restarting of media, of comics, TV series, and films, I want to go into basically where does it start and what storylines, what continuities do we like to believe as fans, what we like to believe as canon. There's a lot to get into. It's going to be a lot to condense into one episode. But
Oh yeah,
Chris, let's see.
it's kind of
So
my job, though, right? Isn't it? Getting it all down into
who
10 minutes.
who better? Who better? Let's have the basics on that. So okay, my first thinking is that when I look at the law of Transformers, is how the Transformers themselves were created. There's enough things to go with. We can go with Quintessons, we can go with the Cube, we can go with Primus and whatever.
That's the three big ones, isn't it? Really, but then two of those are almost the same thing now.
Yeah, and a lot of time has been spent bringing a lot of these continuities together, generally with one-shot comics. But where, broadly speaking, from your perspective, where do we as fans like to claw onto an origin story and say, yes, I believe this is a nice origin story for me? Does it have a bearing to how you entered the fandom particularly, or is there a one source of truth?
I think, yeah. I mean, probably but it's not a universal truth, but the one you probably gravitate towards is the one that you first encounter when you're 8 years old, isn't it?
Yeah,
As with these things, that becomes the one you hold in your mind. I know for me, I think it's hard to remember going back so far, but I think the first one I encountered was the Primus origin story in the UK comic. Though I think the first time I read it was when they were reprinting Legacy of Unicron later in the comic's life, not the original printing of that storyline. I read some issues of the comic when I was young, but I never got it regularly every week. And likewise, well, we live in the UK, so we didn't watch the cartoon. I don't think I knew about the Quintesson origin story until getting on the internet, literally. Um, so for me, well, I don't know that I genuinely have a one I prefer. I guess I probably do lean towards the Primus one, but that might be more for its sheer ubiquity today rather than because it happened to be the first one that I explored or first one that I encountered. I definitely had a lot of time for the Quintesson origin story when I first learned about it, but they're two very different origins. I mean, and it's not just age. They almost speak to two completely different genres of story, don't they? Because the
very
Quintesson
much.
one is a real sci-fi story, a real allegorical Silver Age sci-fi Twilight Zoney story of the robots created to be slaves rising up against their oppressors,
Mm.
which obviously is an idea that has persisted in a different form through to modern backstories for Transformers, where the Primus origin story is something much more fantastical, much more space fantasy. It's much more epic in scope, and I always felt that like the G1 cartoon tended towards stories like that. Later revealing that Unicron was again another case of a science experiment gone wrong, a uh, a creation of somebody who rebelled against his master. Get stories like the Dinobots being built, and story that's just where the G1 cartoon tended towards.
Yeah, I think you touched on it. It really does depend on where you kind of come into it, as because it's almost such polar opposites of the fandom. I think as the cartoon progressed, particularly season three, and then going into the rebirth as well, the thought of the Quintessons being the fathers of Transformers made for slaves, and it was very much a Spartacus-esque uprising
Mhm.
against the masters, wasn't it? Which is something explored in history, so it's believable, it's relatable to a point.
A
But I
shame in
also,
many ways that it was only ever backstory,
yeah,
and even now that idea persists only in backstory, stuff that gets explained or summarized in things. We never actually get any stories actually really looking at that, except for that one flashback episode, which showed like a key turning point in the conflict against the Quintessons. Forever is a long time coming.
But we got a War Dawn episode, which was as
Mm.
set back as anything else, which was great. Don't get me wrong, but let's keep that trend and have a War Dawn for Quintessons and the Uprising.
I mean, it's the question, isn't it, of how essential you consider the origins of the war to like the Transformers backstory, because so much of Transformers media for a long time, uh, most of Transformers media really, but right up until the 21st century, it was all set in the now. And the idea that there was this ages long war was just backstory that had been, and you would get flashback episodes and recaps and history videos and things. But it wasn't until, let's say, The War Within, Dreamwave's comic, that it was really like, okay, we are going back. We are showing the rise of Optimus Prime and Megatron. We are showing how, not how it started, because the war is already underway in The War Within, but taking it, it's, like War Dawn. War Dawn is sort of the start, but the Decepticons are already out there doing evil as well. But then a lot of stuff in the last couple of years, like IDW's 2019 series or the War for Cybertron cartoon on Netflix. Well, again, the war's already started in it too, but they really forefront the idea of the war, and even something like the War for Cybertron video game, about being about the past on Cybertron. This was something that was just window dressing in the 80s that would be occasionally looked at, but the here and the now was what the stories were about. But as that fascination with the lore of Transformers, what we're here to talk about, has grown with the franchise and with the fandom as we've grown up, so many more stories have been have taken the time to not just look back at it, but be fully set back in that time. And we just got a flipping movie about it.
We did as well. And well, that seems a good a time to segue into it. Transformers 1, which has taken fandom by storm, if not the box office, although give it time, it's early days.
Hasn't taken the UK in any way at all yet at time of recording.
No, no, that's very true. At time of recording, give it.
We have both seen it though, right?
You and I have both seen it. Yes.
We have, yeah.
And it's, take it from me, it's absolutely brilliant. And again, it does. It focuses again on the start of the war, not again the origins of Transformers. In as much as we have pre-existing Cybertronians, and that's not much of a spoiler to give away, but it shows a civil war breakout, and that's very much what Transformers is accentuated around: civil war, which we understand. But as I say, there's every story has a beginning, and we've got at least 3 to choose from, and there has been more explored, particularly with IDW in the first iteration, going to Primus and well, Marvel as well, and possibilities of descendants passing down through the original 13 primes. And there's a lot to get your teeth into. But as you've quite rightly said, a lot of it is just window dressing.
The prime stuff in particular, that's a concept that it's such a lower-headed concept. They came up with this mythic idea, and I was never opposed to it or anything, but I always felt, even back in the 2000s, whenever it was clear that they were cooking something behind the scenes and they kept talking about it at convention panels and things, but we were never seeing it in action, I always thought it was better left indistinct, like that it was better that these things were left as figures of myth, maybe true, maybe not. And they didn't, but even so much of what they do with them is still, there aren't many good stories about the primes. There is,
really? No.
There's the Covenant, the Covenant of Primus book, which is just a summary of what they got up to, which is like, right, here it is. This is what we've been doing. We told you we were going to do it 3 years ago. Here it is finally in book form. And it's just a list of box checking and answering questions they got asked at convention panels. This is this and this is that. And to its credit, and there's not a lot I'll credit it with, but to its credit, it does try to preserve that mythic notion. It tries to map the figures of the 13 onto certain mythical archetypes: your Skyfather, your Trickster, your Underworld God, your Earth Mother. But a lot of stories also try and just treat them like they were just guys. Yes, okay, they
Mm.
were the first creations and in many ways
But
demigods,
they weren't anything
but
special.
yeah, I mean, IDWs in particular, revealing they were just tribal leaders, or even Transformers 1, doesn't really present them as being anything more than just happening to be the first guys.
And as well, going into it deeper into Transform, but keeping around the Primus thing, I thought it was quite interesting. I only thought of this like yesterday. The origins of Unicron, you touched on it as well. I like the idea of Primus and Unicron being brothers and one being banished to another universe, and we can get into a whole multiverse thing where we'll be here all day. But
No.
that in itself is quite far removed from the first introduction of Unicron. That no backstory to him whatsoever. He was just kind of floating aimlessly through space on a bit of a munch.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to, what am I talking about? Everybody tends to, like in Unicron to Galactus from Marvel
Mm-hmm.
Comics. That's certainly how the finished film anyway. In the last year or two, we've finally got access to the first version of the movie script, and there was an origin for him in there.
Yes.
And it's not unlike the cartoon. He was built by the Junkions in the case of that story to
Mm-hmm.
be a universal protector, but he went bad because that's G1 cartoon storytelling. Um, but yeah, in the finished film, he is just this cosmic force roaming the spaceways, eating whatever falls into his path that some alien civilizations have clearly heard of because the Lithones know who he is. But that the heroes of the story, whether it's the Transformers or the Fantastic Four, they've never heard of him. And yeah, and then obviously Galactus got an origin story a few years later, back in the 60s. Was it in the 60s when they told his origin? Around that time anyway. Jack Kirby did it. And yeah, Unicron gets the same, and it's not a dissimilar origin story in that they are these beings from the dawn of time who have spent their existence like eating their way through reality.
I suppose with 40 years of material, it's up to us to kind of pick which one we like. It doesn't help when other editions come out in the meantime, and then we almost end up, I think, choosing our own lore that we like to believe, depending again
Oh
on
yeah,
upbringing. But if you think we've gone from the 1984 cartoon right up to Transformers 1, similarities, yes, but a straight line it is not. And you've got to kind of thread your way of saying, well, okay, it's predating, but we've got a lot of things to come. I mean, my first thing when I saw um, the first trailer for Transformers 1, and this won't be too much of a spoiler, but I said, how does this Megatron go to IDW Tyrant Megatron, the big black stealth bomber,
yeah.
where it couldn't be more different in terms of a transition? The movie does kind of lean into that a bit more, but it's again, there's so much for us to choose from. It's up to us to thread an A to B almost, which can be
Hmm.
quite time consuming in and of itself.
I mean, the first like 25 years, it's very much, yeah, here's a bunch of scattershot ideas. And sometimes something like the BotCon comics, say, the Universe comics, which were the first thing to take. Dreamwave sort of nodded towards it, but they didn't get there. But then, like, the Universe comics were like, well, here is how you could reconcile the Primus and the Quintesson origin story with the idea that the Quintessons didn't create the Transformers, they just interfered in the development of Primus's creations, enslaved them. And and then you hit 2010, and that's when the aligned continuity happens. And then it really is you can chart the thread through the last 25 years that has picked up all these disparate ideas along the way, and then the aligned continuity pulls them all together. And it really has been a straight line since the aligned continuity, because
Yeah.
everything since then has been informed by that, just with each thing putting its own spin on it. Sometimes by pulling an old idea from beforehand back, or dropping an idea that the aligned continuity brought in because it doesn't work so much. Like, I think the big one obviously is the idea of Optimus Prime's origins and him being a reincarnated member of the 13, which literally nothing has actually done again because that's not good. That's not wise.
But that actually very, very nicely goes on to a point I was going to ask you. You may have just answered the question. Is there anything that has been suggested as lore as Transformers that you personally go, I don't buy that. That doesn't sit with me.
I mean, yeah, that's certainly one thing. Yeah. Uh, again, and going back to what I was saying about the Covenant, it preserves that mythic thing, the idea of your destined hero, destined for the role of primehood by birth, Um, but it's not as interesting as an ordinary guy proving his worth through his heroic deeds, And depending on when this comes out, it'll either be out already or be about to come out. But I've just done a basics episode about Orion packs. So these thoughts are all whirling around in my head right now anyway, so it's a good time to do this episode. But in classic 80s media, the idea was that he was just an ordinary guy who through his own heroism, his own brave spirit, was judged worthy to be leader and became one. And then it wasn't until and then the Matrix came into it. But the idea was always supposed to be, I suppose this is another idea that's kind of come in that I don't love as much, but it was always supposed to be, just based on the film, that Rodimus was chosen. Like he was a special boy who was chosen to be like, but he was the destined child of prophecy who would use the Matrix to light the darkest hour, and that's why Primus looks like him, because that was the point, because Rodimus was the one chosen one. Um, but as time goes on, the idea that the Matrix chooses its bearers creeps in. Even towards the end of the Marvel comics, you get the idea that some Transformers are made with an affinity for it. You get Thunderwing talking about the affinity with the Matrix that he was born with. But then you hit the 2000s and you hit War Within, and suddenly that's a story about how a data archivist who's never seen the wrong end of a gun in his life, who just sits in an office and files papers, is suddenly called over the intercom to the room upstairs to be told he's going to be the next Prime without ever having done anything to justify it. And that idea persists on into the live action movies, where you have the idea that Optimus was born a Prime, that he's an actual descendant of the 13. And I think it must have been, again, we're talking about that thread that you can see the aligned continuity pulled all the ideas together for. But you have to assume that the aligned continuity's idea that he was a reincarnated member of the 13 was in some way an outgrowth of the live action movie's idea that he was literally like the descendant of a demigod. Um, and then everything since has been like, no, no, we'll pull it back. We'll just do that he's a normal guy who proves his worth. We get the librarian, the data archivist idea from Dreamwaves Comics, but we then paste back. They go back and they take the idea out of the original series that it was his deeds that proved him worthy. I think get this
Yeah, and
standardized backstory now that it's this pursuit of equality and the desire to tear down the unequal system of Cybertron that is what proves him worthy to be leader. Whether
yeah,
he's chosen for the role by Alpha Trion, by the previous guy who had the Matrix, who said you're the one, or whether it's by Primus, or by the Matrix itself, a divine right, a King Arthur sort of story, where King Arthur wasn't just an ordinary guy; he was the son of a king who didn't know he was, and
yeah. The origin of Matrix and how it gets passed down. I do have to remind myself, considering how heavy it's woven into lore
yeah.
nowadays, it was only introduced on Optimus Prime's deathbed,
Mm.
really. And
Well, I
since
mean, I
then,
mean, the creation matrix in the Marvel comics in there from like the fifth issue, but that's not the same thing until a few
no,
years later when Simon Furman goes, "Hey, these two things have the same name," and
yeah,
puts them
yeah,
together.
exactly, yeah, and ties it in. But to that point, it was a case of, well, you think of what we have now, and of going into live action movies, and how the Matrix is physically passed down in the cartoon to then sort of mystically appearing out of dust and then finding a new leader, which could tie into a Ultra Magnus not being worthy or whatever. But then I always kind of feel like, well, hold on a minute. Magnus can't be leader, but Alpha Trion can hold on to it for so
Well,
long.
you look at the movie, and it's like Prime says it himself. Prime, I'm just a soldier. I'm not worthy. Nor was I. He wasn't chosen. Rodimus, everybody was just supposed to be a custodian of the thing
Yeah,
until Rodimus came along to fulfill the prophecy. But then that's another change that we see now. Um, but sometimes it's hard to know, because something that specifically the aligned continuity introduces um, is that no Prime has ever had the Matrix. except the Matrix was originally an artifact of the 13. It depends on the telling. What sometimes it's the gem on the hilt of Prima's sword, or we've seen the different version of it in Transformers One, where it's just the artifact held by the 13th Prime.
Mm.
But the idea is that it has been lost since that time, and none of the primes who have ruled Cybertron are true primes. None of them have been chosen to bear the Matrix by Primus, by its will, because it's not they've been primes in name only. Whereas Optimus is explicitly the first prime to be chosen by God since the days of old, fulfilling his divine destiny. And how does Rodimus fit into that? How does the because we've had the Prime, that is to say Transformers Prime, called him the last of the primes, or there you had something like Cyberverse, which specifically ends on the note that and Prime obviously ends with the Matrix being sacrificed and merging with the Allspark and everything. So there's no more Matrix, there's no more primes. Cyberverse ends on the note that they're going to enter a new post-war era of peace, a time without primes. So the idea that Hot Rod was this special boy is kind of lost, and it's hard to map onto the current view of Optimus Prime, and because even one does that again, although one's not quite as guilty of it because in things like IDW, say, or other series, where there have been multiple primes, your Nova, Nominus, Sentinel, there have been multiple guys pretending to the title down through all these years, and it's only eventually the rise of Optimus that brings a true prime back. In one, there's one guy, and there's one guy who was specifically faking it, and that's it. And then Optimus is the one who reclaims the title at the end, and that works better when there's not a whole legacy of fakers down through history. So you can still imagine there being more primes after Optimus because they haven't set it up that way.
But yeah, that's such a good point, because think about when, and I feel like we're staying on the Matrix, but I'll go into other bits in a second. But
hey, what else is there? It's central to so much of this stuff.
Well, look at whenever a Decepticon's got their hands on the Matrix, it's kind of been useless. And as you rightly say, the pretenders, to someone like Nova Prime, who probably wouldn't know a Matrix if it bit him on the backside. Certainly he was more concerned about being a ruler than having any kind of.
I mean, he was the one who had it because he like took it off of Primus sword or something. Like, he had it, but he couldn't make it do anything.
Yeah,
that was the thing in his comics. He gave it to his scientists and said, "This is supposed to be able to make life. Stick electrodes in it until you can figure out how to make it do that." And that was, but he couldn't like use its power. He didn't become a prime through its power. Yeah. Of course, even one is guilty of propagating the idea, which really only begins in The War Within, that acquiring the Matrix is accompanied by a big transformative power-up that turns you into a prime form. Whereas, originally, again, the point was Rodimus was a special boy. So it only happened to him, and that's why it didn't happen to Magnus, and it didn't happen to Optimus before him.
I really like the idea of the Matrix kind of powering up, and I've always said this before, like, I can imagine one day, because I've had my own theory, is that Bumblebee could one day become the full-time leader of the Autobots, given his popularity and rise. And again,
something that you could only really say in the last 10, 15 years or so, but definitely a believable idea now, yes.
But you couldn't imagine a 1984 Bumblebee just assuming a mantle and being done with it. He'd have to have a Rodimus, Hot Rod Rodimus-esque transformation, almost going up into a live action movie kind of transformation build to do such a thing. But you're right, when you think of War Dawn, Optimus Orion is built into Optimus with no Matrix upgrade.
And to be fair, obviously that's because the idea didn't really exist yet. But it just happens to map on to the wider, and then like so much of this stuff when it comes to Transformers is things just happened to work out that way. And then later it was like people saw, and then these ideas coalesce, like the very idea of there being a Matrix in the comic and a Matrix in the cartoon. We used to think, many years ago, that the Matrix in the film must have been named after the Matrix in the comic. But then we got a hold of the first draft of the movie script, and even though it's not the same thing, the central MacGuffin, the glowy ball of the film, even though it is the Matrix in that first draft of the script, written at the end of 1984, at about the same time as Bob Budiansky is starting to write the 5th issue of the comic that's going to introduce the Matrix. Could be a complete coincidence that there are two things called the Matrix. But someone sees it, someone threads those two things together.
And we see it again, I think, briefly in Revenge of the Fallen, isn't it? When the Matrix more or less brings Optimus back to life. Is it Revenge of the Fallen?
Yeah, Revenge of the
Yeah.
Fallen.
And what it can do, what it leads to, it very much depends on what do you want the Matrix to be at this point. Like, we can bring people back to life, we can upgrade bodies. There's no one thing necessarily.
But so many of those, like those examples, you do see there's a thought in, like, it cures the hate plague because it's curing madness with the wisdom it contains, because in the cartoon that's just what the Matrix is. It's a container of the memories, the life forces of past leaders. It's the collection of their wisdom, so it cancels that. Bringing back, I mean, Revenge of the Fallen is a bit funny on that, right? Because in dialogue, Sam's whole thought process of how he could use the Matrix to bring Optimus back to life is because the Matrix was the activator for the Star Harvester. So his thought was like, well, if it could activate that big machine, could it activate the big machine that's my mate? So, yeah. But like, we know that the intention that was in the script, because we know from the novelization, it doesn't clearly come across in the film, is that all the all-spark power and knowledge that's in Sam's head, it goes into the Matrix, and that essentially makes the Matrix. And then, that's when it reforms out of the dust and everything. And that's why Sam's not seeing symbols or acting crazy anymore by the end of the film, because everything that was in his head has gone into the Matrix. And that essentially makes the Matrix the same thing as it not ever was, but had come to be understood, a powerful talisman of both wisdom and the ability to create life. So which is it? Which of those two things is the reason it brings Optimus back to life? Is it the stated reason that Sam thought it would, because it's a big power on switch, or is it because it's got the mystical stuff of life in it from the Allspark? I don't know. That, asking for an answer to that, maybe asking too much of the live action movies.
Maybe, but you think you're gonna throw it into a film. I think as you hit the nail on the head, and you're saying that quite often these answers happen unintentionally. And then they've sort of, oh, look, we've tied these things together now, more by a happy coincidence. And you end up making sense of it. The live action movies, I think, somewhat stumbled their way through pre-existing lore. And we've seen it again since. We see borrowed storylines, reincarnated stuff to say, oh, yes, that was its intention from a long way off. And you think, well, it is now, but whether that was the plan from the outset. Yeah, exactly.
But like, you talk about what the Matrix does, and it's like, even now, I'm not sure I could tell you. Particularly, and I mean that very specifically now, in a post-aligned continuity world, where the Allspark is introduced in the live-action films explicitly as just being a stand-in for the Matrix, because they were afraid about using the name because they thought people would hear Matrix and think of the Keanu Reeves film. So they made up the Energon Cube instead, and then they renamed that the Allspark. But then, by the end of the decade, the two major pieces of media that have featured the Allspark, the movies and animated, have said, okay, and turned the Allspark back into being the Matrix again.
Yeah.
But then a year later, a line comes along and says, no, the Matrix and the Allspark are two different things. One makes life, and then the other Matrix it's got the wisdom of the primes in it, but also it can shoot energy beams and power you up. And what is it?
We got more, haven't we? We got the key to Vector Sigma. Vector Sigma
is
a plasma energy chamber. I mean, which divine entity is it? What does what? What exists without the other? What absolutely needs to sustain? I personally like the Matrix ending the hate plague. I like it felt a bit of a nice rounded conclusion. Wisdom from the ages, being completely spent and used up that even at the end of the 86 movie, it didn't do, we don't think, but we actually physically see it empty, curing the galaxy of madness. Nice. I get that.
Yeah, yeah.
Good overcoming evil makes sense. But then, as I just say, plasma energy chamber, all of these
Well, plasma
other
energy
things.
chamber is just a furnace. It's not it's pretty technical in its function. It's not, yeah. That's where they make the bodies though, and that's just fully out the window now. I'm quite fond of the idea of them, yeah, emerging from the planet, the core, the metal. Um it's more fantastical, definitely, but it lends itself more to the idea of them as a species rather than something somebody built.
With them being not an organic species, you can kind of do what you like. You can say they're constructed cold, they're made in factories, they're spiritually born because they're not organic. So they don't have to have a biological breeding necessarily. Although we have tried that with Scorponok having a baby inside him. Transformers was strange at points.
I
But
think people make too much of that one, to be honest. He was just going to get a load of humans to boff and then steal their bodies.
of course, yes. Who hasn't
Yeah,
done
that's that. That's better, isn't it? That sounds perfectly normal. It's for kids, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
I do
So
wish that the whole growing out of the planet thing could get a bit more exposure outside of comics, though, because when you had something like, because it is notionally the bang my table, because it is notionally the origin currently, the modern understood origin of the species, but it doesn't get talked about very much. You had IDW's comics doing their hotspots, and you have the idea of the Well of All Sparks, which is really only in the Aligned continuity, which really only comes up occasionally. You look at something like Cyberverse had a nice touch on the general idea, where what we were saying about the weird indistinction of the Matrix and Vector Sigma and the Allspark before, where the Allspark was responsible for creating life, but they folded Vector Sigma back into it by having like the computer, like it controlled and programmed the Allspark and could direct it to create a particular kind of life, which is more interesting, I think, to me personally anyway, than simply having somebody construct cold, to use the
yeah,
IDW parlance, a new robot body and then they're just born. But no, the idea that certainly in the case of Cyberverse, that the forces of creation are perverted almost by the Decepticons getting their hands on Victor Sigma and using it to create. But when you see the Allspark actually perform the act of creation in Cyberverse, they literally just poof. It's, again, fully not what they intended, but goes back to what they were saying about how sometimes these things work out. Like you got the Collectors Club magazine establishing the idea that at the molecular level, sparks and the living metal of Cybertron and Transformers bodies are composed of a rarefied form of energon, which is in and of itself the energy of Primus itself. Like the idea that the energy of Primus is energon is something that kind of comes from energon, that is to say that the series energon bodies. Then the aligned continuity, I really think it maybe only like comes up in the Exodus novel, but it does explicitly say in there, yes, our bodies and sparks are made of the same stuff as energon. So I can take that knowledge, carry it forward a decade, and look at a transformer appearing in a flash of light in Cyberverse and go, ah, yes, created from energon, created from a condensed, solidified form of energon, plucked from the ether. Yes, I can make this make sense. Definitely not what the Cyberverse guys intended when they depicted that, but I can make it make sense.
Yeah, you can put it together. But saying that, Spark with the Terrans,
Big one, right?
Yeah, kind of went a little bit. It kind of put a spanner into it. As much as I like Spark and I like the Terrans, I do. It's yet another conduit, yet another avenue of saying how are we creating races suddenly?
Well, the introduction of another artifact, yeah. But again, that goes back to the Alliance continuity. The Ember Stone is introduced in the 13 backstory as being something Quintus Prime uses to sow life on other planets. So it immediately introduces this idea that there's this other life creating thing. Now, personally, I really like the idea of the Terrans being created from the matter of Earth in the way that Transformers are created from the matter of Cybertron.
Cybertron.
Literally something never seen before. Oh, but you have the suggestion that that's how Transformers on the colonies came into being. Well, in
Mm.
IDW, the hotspots and the metal from which they are born are from the bodies of the Titans who have come from Cybertron, and in Cybertron, it's really not clear. But again, go back to the Covenant. They talk about using the energy of the Allspark to light replicas of the well on the colonies. So the idea that the colonists are genuinely born from the matter of their world, and I like that. But again, that goes back to what I was saying about how I'd like to see it get more exposure, because before Allspark came out and they were promoting it and talking about the first bots born on Earth, and dweebs in the comments were going, somebody clearly doesn't remember the Dinobots, and I'm like, listen, dickhead, it's not the same thing. You don't get it, because this idea has not, although it is notionally the origin today in modern lore, it doesn't have that level of exposure to understand that there is a difference between built and born. It's constructed,
Yes.
cold, and forged, and that is a distinction that was very much being drawn in the creation of the Terrans from the substance of Earth.
Refreshing when something like that comes along to do something a little bit different. And going into Skybound as well. Now, Skybound has a lot of similarities to original G1 or
Yeah,
original comics.
hard to talk
It
about
does,
anything like currently. There's the Quintessons are in the mix, but
yeah, but there's similar yet different. But this is with Earthspark in particular. It feels like it's just a way to do fresh, a way to do familiar Transformers of a type, but not as you remember them, and not as you can choose to use the same ideology from Optimus and Bumblebee as you can for Twitch and Thrash. Which is great, because it makes the series stand on its own 2 feet, and as we saw, thank God, it is coming back for a third season, or
well,
part two,
I mean,
whatever it's going to be. Yeah,
yeah, I mean that's kind of that's sort of the problem with the second season of Earthspark, though, is that a lot of that nuance is just been fully punted out the window with a powerful kick, where now the Terrans are just junior Autobots who fully subscribe to their ideology, and the Decepticons are all bad again, and there's none of that idea of the Terrans as a third column. Um, maybe I don't know. Maybe they can. Maybe we'll see in this new batch of episodes coming this month if they can pull it back at all. But they really did. They really
it's a nice
did
idea,
damage
though,
to
wasn't
their.
it?
It was a nice idea. Well,
Yeah.
let's see. Maybe not write it off fully just yet, but let's see.
Well, going on to just a quick one, then, what particular or origin or particular piece of lore have you kind of had a second bite at, and you think, oh, I quite like that? I'll give you my example to my own question. I always felt the Dinobots were kind of bumbled and handled badly in G1. Suddenly, this race of Transformers crashes on Earth, wakes up in 1984. They're down on resources. Even the G1 cartoon somewhat played on that. Yet they can make 5 massive dinosaurs of components and parts that are just lying around. Sparks get generated, all the rest of it, and they got these
Well,
5
let's not
war
talk about
machines.
sparks. That's a whole other thing. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, but they can make them, and they're not exactly in a flush state. Maybe after season 2, they're a bit more incorporated into Earth, but
Well,
they're
if
not
you go
exactly
off the
ready.
back of the end of the original miniseries, they've got the full support of Earth's governments, and they've got all the energy they need from them and everything. So it's not, it's the
Maybe,
Decepticons who are always after energy.
but it's you always feel like, oh, you just constructed 5 Dinobots. My liking is that the Dinobots always kind of existed on Cybertron, and
Sure.
this gets mentioned in I think it was the Beast Wars IDW comic, where they say the Dinobots themselves were a race of Cybertronians, like a subsect. And I liked the idea of Grimlock always kind of fighting in a gladiatorial pit. That I never
Sure.
felt that gets explored enough. Megatron as well.
It's a funny one, right?
Very
Because
part of their
IDW in
characters.
particular liked to make nods towards Grimlock's past, but it never actually got around to really exploring them,
No,
you know.
and there's a lot there that you
But
can
you can see
do.
how that the Marvel Comics version of has very much won out in terms of modern lore, where animated. It's really the only thing to do the idea of the Dinobots being built on Earth in any capacity, and otherwise, yeah, they're all just normal guys from Cybertron now. But that's because of the general idea of like literally just plugging a guy together in a lab.
Yeah.
You don't see it anymore because of that idea of evolving the concept of Transformers beyond just being something somebody can build and making them a real species with a complexity um, that prohibits that.
Let's talk about another thing very quickly. Quickly, the enigma of combination or combiners. This is another
Sure.
one. I love talking about combiners, but how again they were introduced to us that a team can be made, and it was quite quickly turned into stories that Megatron had perfected the art of making a combiner with Devastator, but that quickly went into Shockwave and Jaxus
Mm-hmm.
with Monstructor and the likes, and failed experiments before. There's a lot to it. There's actually probably more individual lore in combiners than say Titans or others, because
Oh
you can
yeah.
say
Titans was
how
like there are big guys, and then one day they decided, and they're very old, and that's just how we understand Titans.
but we've got so much into why there's a combining team, what
Mm.
happens when they don't get on, what happens when they're all together, and then the comics IDW in particular throughout the Enigma combination went sod it, anyone can be a combiner if they really think hard enough. I feel there's a lot they could have done with it. I think they could have. I like the idea of what did they call it? Like naturally combining, like teams that had
Yeah,
no interest. They didn't know they could combine, but they sort of willed it together. And you've got, I think, Superion and maybe Defense Sword. They just kind of said, "We want to do this, so we're going to do it."
yeah, the very idea that as a species, like that they could spontaneously evolve the ability to combine, like that, independent of anything. I don't hate the Enigma. I don't love the Enigma, but that sort of goes back to what I was saying about the 13 earlier, where the 13 were created to like with a view to the Transformers like being a species. Well, then what is the origin point of these branched versions of the species? Why do some Transformers turn into animals? Why are some Transformers minicons? Why do some Transformers combine? With the idea being that like the genetic potential being an idea that Dreamwave instituted first in their profiles, where we had the idea that you had to have this certain, or the War Within, the Dark Ages. That was another one. Did it? Can't remember which one came first, but Dreamwave did anyway. Um, the idea that it was like, well, if you can combine, why isn't everybody doing it? And Dreamwave went, well, because you have to have the unique genetic potential in your spark to be able to do that. So that's where the 13 comes in. It's like, well, where does this? What's the origin of this unique genetic potential? Um, so the again, just thinking of it in a purely like mythical demigod sort of way, the idea that one of the gods might have the mystical artifact that he can point at you and turn you into like one of his children, as it were,
Mm.
give you the full unfettered power that his descendants also hold. Yeah, that's not bad. That functions as an idea, but it goes back to how I preferred the idea of the 13 as just myths. I mean, IDW 19, the 2019 reboot, there was a scene in that where they talked about where Termagax was talking about the artifacts of the primes, and I loved that scene where she was saying, "Are these really the leftover artifacts of the primes, like the Matrix and other things that still exist today? The Matrix, the Enigma, are they really the leftover artifacts of these things from our legends, or did we as a race create these legends?" And I love that scene because that to me was because obviously in a real life context, that's exactly what the 13 are. Stuff created by a bunch of writers and artists in an office at Hasbro to retroactively explain these traits and attributes of the toys. Then the Enigma just sort of keeps happening and it's the one, isn't it? You know, all of the 13 are supposed to have an artifact, but like there's the Forge Forge of Solus Prime gets a bit of time in Prime. There's the Star Saber, which predated the idea, which they mapped onto it later. Same for the Matrix. I challenge you to name me another one besides the Enigma.
I cannot, if I'm being
Yeah.
perfectly honest. But it's just
I
basically.
mean, I can because I'm a massive dweeb, but you know, these things do not. That's just the one that for some reason is latched on. And now it's like if anybody wants to be a combiner, it's just that. We just blame that. Always, always, always that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know, we don't have to do that. You don't have to, you know, that is something that I can imagine being done in a lab. Like somebody undergoes a process to refit their body, to reformat their body, to be rebuilt or refashioned or reforged in some way to give them that ability, based on a genetic potential, sure. Uh, but you know, you don't have to be zapped by a magic laser beam to turn. I remember I said this a while back on Twitter, but it's different. It's like, so when Prowl becomes a combiner in IDW, right? I think it's a little difficult to explain to anybody who wasn't there for that moment in 2016. 13 13 there, but yeah, it started, they started in 2012. So for who wasn't there for that moment in 2013 to understand what an absolute mind blower that was. For because when I think back, I think that might have been sure, we'd had Sunstreaker become a headmaster, but whatever,
it's,
you know,
pretty heavy in its own right.
It was, yeah, absolutely. But there was something about this where it made me go, is this allowed? Can you do this? Is this who okayed this? Is this allowed? It was such a wild idea. But then it's difficult to explain how wild an idea it was to anybody who came into Transformers just a couple of years later in a post-Combiner Wars world where any silly bugger can be a combiner now if they just get zapped by the magic ball.
Yeah, we went into like Sky Rain and Galvatronus and Optimus Maximus, and it did start to get a little bit silly, which is not something I kind of like or like to throw around for combiners. I think there's a lot you can do with combiners, but I felt that was in itself a bit of a misstep. But you're right, that first bit of Prowl combining and the anguish on his face, and you're like,
and this realization as you're reading it, and you're like, wait, what are they do? Are they? Is this allowed? You know, Prowl's just become the new head of Devastator. What?
And he had no interest in Beezer. But I think, as you rightly say, going back to the lab side of it, I think there's again so much you can do, because I like kind of Monstructor as how we saw him in IDW, that the fact that they were the individual bots kind of ceased to be, because this was very much a first draft. And
it drove them mad.
You got a completed combiner. You got your war machine come the end of it, but you sacrificed the minds of 5 individual bots to do so. They kind of no longer function, and I think that maybe more by accident than design kind of ties into what we saw of combiners even back from G1 days. Is the fact that the combiners would be so powerful in and of themselves, they had to have a drawback, and it's the fact that they're 5 minds going at once. They had to kind of be slower, too much going on, and you would see that again in IDW, like Bruticus having all 5 of them kind of.
Oh, that's a good scene. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and you got Dead Swerve, not Swerve, Swindle, kind of just hanging there.
I tend to remember the one from Dreamwave as well. It's only a short scene, but it's the one where the Stunticons are doing the prison breakout. And Magnus just keeps pounding and pounding away at them and taunting Motormaster for like failing at what they're doing. And by the end of it, you know, you have all the Stunticon voices floating around, just like yelling abuse at each other. And that was one of the, as far as like Buddy Ansky's bios went, that was a big one that was really based on their personalities, where, you know, Devastator was like simple-minded, Superion was like single-minded, because it's the only way he can function is if they focus on one specific thing. Defensor, same deal, single-mindedness. But Menasor was the one where it's like, oh, these guys hate that one guy in the middle, and that was why Menasor was a mess.
Yeah. See, that makes a lot of sense, and that kind of gives a uniqueness. That's an origin story you can get behind, and it's kind of like, no, we got this artifact, and it can mean you're not special. You don't have to have an interesting story, even when you're combined. Anyone could be a combiner.
But I suppose in a lot of G1 media, the combiners were built to be combiners. That's kind of the thing about them, right? It's an idea that only comes in later. Yeah, no, that can't really example like because it doesn't work that way, does it? Yeah, because the combiners are in stories where their origins are told. They're built from the moment of their creation to be combiners. Oh no, no, no. I tell a lie. Secret of Omega Supreme, the Constructicons were well, obviously that in and of
We
itself was a retcon. But
yeah,
yes, the idea is
we
that
can
they
go into
did
the
pre-exist and
yeah.
Megatron gave them the ability to combine. Um, but yeah, as I say, Dreamwave is the one that really consolidates the idea that combiner guys, because it's leaving behind the idea that Transformers are lab built.
Yeah.
Well, did Dreamwave leave that back? Oh, I'm getting lost, and I'm getting lost trying to straighten this nonsense out of my head now because it's difficult to
Yeah.
keep it straight sometimes. But
It
yeah,
is.
simply anyway, what I'm saying is Dreamwave had the idea that only certain individuals could be, and that meant that circumstance, as you're saying, sorry to stumble over your point so much, but the point you're making is, yeah, circumstance thrust these groups of characters together. Not that we've ever really seen that play out in any stories I can think of
No.
pre Enigma. But yeah, but in many ways, I suppose the idea of groups of characters being thrust together out of circumstance to form a combiner is even more plausible and explorable in a time where the Enigma exists. If anybody truly now can be a combiner, it is possible to, in the same way it's, where Sunstreaker becomes a headmaster, specifically because Simon Furman said, well, he's the one who'd hate it the most. So wham,
Yeah.
we've stuck him together with a human. I go back to Defensor in the IDW comics, which was a mess. That the Combiner Wars story in IDW's comics clearly produced on the fly, very messy. They didn't know exactly what characters were supposed to be where, but those characters did just happen to be standing next to each other when they got all turned into Defensor, and that was the origin of Defensor.
What a
You five,
coincidence.
you, and he zapped them with the magic ball. You're a Combiner now. And then unfortunately, like the characters were handed back over to More Than Meets the Eye, which had no interest in exploring
Yeah.
any potential there. The idea of Rook as this guy who just happened to be standing next to a bunch of guys who did know each other. There's a real story you can tell there with that. Maybe it's just a one issue spotlight story about him finding his place in the team, but there's a very real story that you can tell born of the idea. I suppose that's the problem. To really, really cut back to the first question that was asked in this portion of the show, I suppose the problem with the Enigma is that nobody's really minded for the best ideas that it can
That it can do,
uh,
yeah.
can do. Yeah.
Very last question that I want to ask you. Is there anything that you particularly feel in lore that hasn't been closed off, like a loophole that you feel needs to kind of have its own piece of media released or a one shot, anything like that to say, we still got a big plot hole here that we need plugged?
Hmm.
So anything that you think this wasn't explained fully to me? I'll give you kind of my example.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that
Because I can't. Nothing's coming to mind.
one thing that with me being a big Beast Wars fan is that they suddenly went back in time, and time travel isn't massively explored in Transformers. I don't believe. I mean, we do have War Dawn, we have elements of it, but it's
You
the
get like
fact
War
that
Dawn, you get Decepticon Raider, and there's the Marvel UK stories. But after you get past
yeah,
that, it's like, yeah.
Time Wars. But yeah, it sort of goes a bit quiet from there, and it's the fact that it's a good excuse to throw a show in is to do let's predate it with time travel. And Beast Wars all came about with transwarp and how G1 Megatron was kind of perfecting transwarp technology and all the rest of it. And it kind of felt like that was going to be the next thing. And it sort of was nothing. And I think whilst I very much like Beast Wars, the whole kind of downsizing, I know this was explained in the comics of how Transformers were going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were just going to grow and outgrow themselves from an energy perspective. So a more modern day ones became smaller and smaller to cope and live. But then it's a bit like, well, that seems quite far removed for what we know and actually what we've had since. I kind of feel like it really made Beast Wars kind of be its own splinter thing from lore. I mean, even when they did the
Yeah,
War for
well,
Cybertron Netflix series, when Kingdom, they sort of tried to close it off with a time travel element. And it's like, what happens to you? Well, let's kind of hope we don't cease to exist. And they sort of
Yeah.
just kind of walk down the road together, just like waiting to vanish.
I mean, that's I'm certainly like of two minds on that because it's like obviously what you're saying about the idea of it feeling like a branch is well, that's because Beast Wars and Beast Machines after it were the last time that a new Transformer series was presented as a continuation of what had gone before it. Well, not the last time because you got other series have been sequels to other series. What I mean is 1984 to 1984 to the year 2000 is one straight line.
Yeah.
The end of Beast Machines is, although the continuity is not precise, it's not specifically a sequel to the cartoon, it's not specifically a sequel to the Marvel comic, but it is presented as like the future of the general world of the Generation One toy line, and it's after that that they start rebooting, really, like in full continuity, full universe reboots. So obviously, as you're saying, the idea is presented in Beast Wars cannot be taken any further. But I would have to say I'm not particular. It's kind of like with the 13, where Beast Wars the cartoon gives you enough information to know that yes, they downsized or they're a new generation at a smaller size, whereas the previous ones were bigger guys and consumed more energy, so they're more energy efficient. And I'm happy to leave it at that. In the same way, I'm happy to leave the idea of the 13 as just a generally expressed. That's what happened in the past, and moving forward, not uh, mostly because the vast majority of attempts to do anything that threads the needle between G1 and Beast Wars are dog poo. Because they get
But you're,
so
you're absolutely
bogged
right.
down in lore. They get so bogged down in explaining this and that and everything. Whereas the idea is that the war ended, life went on, technology marched on, and there was a big technological quantum leap, and life on Cybertron changed. There doesn't have to be anything bigger, more conspiratorial to it than that. And a lot of these stories get bogged down in explaining, oh, the big how the end of the war birthed this conspiracy, or how these guys went underground and this happened and that happened, and so often misrepresenting like beast characters as coexisting with that time period whenever obviously all the G1 stuff was supposed to be ancient history. I mean, because like internal to Beast Wars, all of G1 is handled as if it is ancient history to the Maximals that they don't know that void of time. It That's how it doesn't matter. It is antiquity. Um, but nerds love filling holes. And I don't say that as a criticism. That's just how we're built. Well, I can think of a couple of things. I guess they're not so much lore-y in the big lore sense we're talking about now, but like obviously getting the ending to animated. Mostly, I mean, really, it's just about what was Sari's deal. That's the big unanswered question from animated. I've always said I don't know that I necessarily need a fourth season. And to wrap animated famously didn't get its fourth season, cut short, but mostly where it ends is a decent stopping point. There are just like the two big things of like dealing with the problem of Sentinel Prime being in charge of Cybertron and the question surrounding Sari. And I think that I don't think you need a full fourth season for that. I think a nice like direct to video movie would solve that. So there's that, or there's another one. What was the other one? I mean, there were the Dreamwave comics that got their endings cut. I'm mostly thinking of things that got their endings cut short, but I don't really care about the dream. It's been 20 years. I don't.
It's been
It's
long
been
enough, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been long enough. I'm not bothered about finding out what that purple pool of stuff inside the Earth was in Dreamwave. Other stuff like I mean, like I am genuinely curious what they were cooking up with like the last two live action, the last two Bay movies, where the fourth one is like, I mean, obviously those films have a tenuous relationship to continuity at best, the whole series, but the first three generally hold together in terms of who's where and why is what. All spark shard leading into the second one, and then anyway, but then you hit the fourth one, and it's like creators, aliens, and then Optimus is coming for them at the end. And then the fifth one
Yeah.
is like, well, there's somebody in it who says she's their creator, but it's definitely not that alien hand that we saw briefly, and what was that? You know, because that's in the it's in the post-aligned era whenever all this stuff is starting to come together, and I'm like, what were you cooking there? I am curious about that. Not curious enough that I necessarily think we need a Last Night sequel, but
Oh
I'd
no,
just like
God,
to
no.
know, you know.
Yeah, a
Let them
massive,
make
massive
comics again.
horn sticking out of the ground. Probably Unicron. Oh, look, that's gone nowhere.
Especially now in a post-aligned era, this last 15 years or so, where so much of Transformers echoes and rhymes with everything else that's going on in the franchise, building from a common base. Um, for instance, you know, wanting to know what happens next whenever they're going to wake up Unicron inside the Earth. Well, you know what? There's a three-part story in Transformers Prime that shows you something very much like what might have happened in the film. You know, because these echoes spread out across the franchise. And I mean, if I was being uncharitable, I'd say that the franchise is more homogenous now than it was
Yeah.
in the 2000s. But that's why the ideas we're talking about are mostly things from the 2000s. The unresolved ending of Animated, the unresolved ending of Dreamwave, even the you know the time gap between G1 and Beast Wars, like you're talking about, just from half a decade before that, you know. But in that in the 2010s and beyond,
Okay. I feel we could talk more on this forever and a day, but there's quite a lot for everyone to go through. Sound off in the comments if there's anything that you particularly feel that you think Transformers lore needs to focus more or less on. Is there something that you feel that needs a bit more fleshing out, and something that you feel is your particular thread through Transformers? Because there's enough to choose from. But Chris, thank you so much for coming on. We do
thank you for
know
having me.
you very, very well on YouTube for basics, and as you alluded to, the episode of Orion Pax has gone live, I believe, as of
It's
recording.
as of recording, it's currently up for Patreon supporters, but it will be going live on Saturday, what is today? Saturday the 5th.
Very
So you'll be
nice.
able to see it then. A little longer of an episode than normal, longer than I thought it would be. But as I was making it, I was like, "Oh no, hold on, wait! There are big ideas to talk about here. This just isn't a collection of Optimus Prime origin stories. There is what we spent the last hour and a half talking about. There's a very real thread through all of this stuff, an evolving concept, a real narrative to follow through about how these separate ideas, were formed, happened to rhyme, came together, all these disparate ideas, so they were locked down, and what has been created now informs everything today." So yeah, I'm
Absolutely.
quite pleased with that episode. So I hope everybody checks it out and enjoys it.
And have you got anything else you're working on at the moment?
Just well, always working on the next episode of the basics. It's October now, so Obscure Characters Month is looming large in December. So uh, I don't quite have the full roster for that locked in yet, but I'm like 75% of the way clear on who I'm doing for that one. And outside of Transformers, do check out my podcast as well, Sonic the Comic, the podcast I do with Dave Bulmer, Demon Tomato Dave, every fortnight, where we go issue by issue through the old 1990s British Sonic the Hedgehog comic, Sonic the Comic, a very formative comic in Dave and Mai's life. Which is just a very silly podcast where we just talk about comics and what it was like being a child in the 1990s.
Very much so. Sonic the Comics got me through a lot of my childhood, so that's very much a staple of mine. But thank you so much.
stctp.zone
Very,
is where you
very
can
good.
find that.
I will put that all in the description below. But thank you so much for coming along, Chris. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. And as always, I will see you on the next one.